Have 10 to 15 minutes to speak, and I'll just turn it over to Deepa to start us off.
Thanks, Ashley. So last week I was on a panel at Baruch College. People know Baruch College. And it was about Islamophobia, the media, and so forth. And at one point, one of my co-panelists said, you know, the NYPD spying and surveillance on Muslims in the Northeast is actually perfectly fine. In fact, this is how you apprehend terrorists. This is why the number of terrorist-related incidents have actually been going down, because the police are just doing their jobs. And of course, I'm sitting next to her. My eyes are popping off their sockets, falling on the table, you know. And of course, I responded to it. But what was disturbing is that I looked in the audience, and of course, by this point, I had put my eyes back in my sockets. I looked at the audience, and there's agreement, right? Not among everyone, but certainly among a section of the audience. People are nodding when she says the police are just doing their jobs and the number of terrorism cases has gone down because of the great job that the NYPD has done. And this shouldn't surprise us. Actually, a poll found that 60% of New Yorkers have no problem with what the NYPD has been doing, you know, infiltrating student groups, sending informers into mosques, going to bookstores, businesses, creating this thing called the human mapping program that the CIA actually helped the NYPD to formulate, which is in essence a process of spying and surveillance. Now, the reason why I think that sections of the audience from last week, as well as this poll, actually have think that this is okay is because there's been a climate in this country since 9/11 where there's been a relentless demonization of Muslims. Islamophobia is nothing if not anti-Muslim racism and scapegoating to serve two ends. First and foremost, to win our consent for the war on terror, right? You need an enemy. You need an overarching enemy, the Islamic terrorist, which then wins our consent to spending trillions of dollars on wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and so forth. And secondly, whenever a country is at war with somebody else out there, inevitably there is a war on those people right here in this country. And so what I want to do is, in the time that I have, is really speak to both of these assumptions that have become common sense, that the U.S. should be involved in these wars abroad to keep us safe, that the NYPD should be involved in this sort of surveillance to keep us safe, and puncture these myths and call them out for what they are. They're racism in the service of empire. Now, just a few more quick things about the NYPD scandal. I mean, I have to say that the Associated Press, which actually broke this scandal, starting last August, they've been releasing a whole number of reports. It's been excellent that they've done this because they've opened up a space for the first time since 9/11 where people have actually started to talk about what's been happening to Muslims in this country, Muslims and Arabs in particular in this country. It's largely gone under the radar, right? For many people, this is the first time that they're hearing that Muslims and Arabs have been prosecuted and persecuted in this kind of way. And to some extent, we've actually got some criticism from people in positions of power. So Yale University president, for instance, actually gave the most strong statement against this kind of spying at Yale University. He denounced it. He said, profiling on the grounds of nationality, religion, and so on is simply unacceptable. Similarly, Cory Booker, the mayor of Newark, came out and said that this sort of racial profiling is unacceptable. And Chris Christie, of course, also, huffed and puffed. But his huffing and puffing was more like, why are these people in my kingdom without first asking my permission? But suffice it to say, there's been something of a pushback around this, and it's opened up a space. And I think we should take advantage of the space that this has created to put forward arguments and facts about the reality on the ground for Muslim Americans in this country over the last decade. And so the first thing I want to start with is this threat, this menace of the Islamic terrorist, right? We've been taught time and time again to be really scared. You go anywhere, a subway station or the airport, it says if you see something, say something, and so on and so forth. And you have shows like 24 which reinforce this notion that terrorists are everywhere and that we have to be vigilant. I've been giving a few talks on this topic over the last few years, and one of the questions that I've come to ask to see what kind of impact this propaganda has had is to ask people in the audience, how many people have died as a result of this Islamic terrorist over the last year, over the last 2 years, and so on. You guys are a pretty sophisticated audience, so I won't put that question to you. I'll just say that the answer I get, of course, there was one outlier. Someone said 100,000, which, makes you think, 100,000, wow. But generally, people come back with things like 5,000, 10,000. And just last month, a sociologist, a very well-read sociologist, someone who has a PhD, studies society and so on, he said 1,000, right? That's the figure that people come back with. But if you actually look at State Department figures, the last year for which data is available, which is 2010, around the world, the number of American civilians who died as a result of Islamic terrorism is a grand total. You ready? Drum roll, 15, right? And most of this happened in Afghanistan, which if the US wasn't there, would not have happened, right? The year before that, it was 9. And then a report that was released last month by the Triangle Center based in North Carolina found that of the 14,000 murders that took place in the United States last year, 0 is attributable to Islamic terrorism, as it's called. And of course, what's absent, in this sort of hype and propaganda that's created around keeping us safe from the Muslim terrorists, is we're not told how many people, for instance, have died as a result of workplace-related injuries and accidents, right? That number consistently is around 5,000. So a 9/11 into 2 happens every year to regular workers in this country. You take the number of people who die each year in this country because they lack access to health care. That number is 45,000, 15 times the number of people who died on 9/11. But there is no war on corporations. There is no war on the healthcare industry. But there is a war on terror because there's a larger agenda at work. Now, there are 2 lawyers here who can speak to this in terms of how the legal system has been reorganized in order to prosecute and persecute Muslims. But I'll just lay out a big sort of snapshot so people get a sense of where this panel is coming from. This war on Muslims didn't start after 9/11. It actually goes back to the 1970s when President Nixon introduced Operation Boulder, where people from Arabic-speaking countries were interrogated and seen as being suspicious, and so on and so forth. This has continued. It was continued under the Carter administration, with Iranians in particular being seen as suspicious people after the hostage crisis in 1979-1980. Reagan continued it. Bush Sr. actually took it one step further in the form of allowing the FAA to racially profile particularly Arabs and so on and so forth. But it was Bill Clinton, actually. It was under Bill Clinton's reign, the 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, that actually opened the floodgates to all sorts of practices that then get enshrined in the Patriot Act. And others can speak to this in more detail. But just to give you some examples of what happened, immediately after 9/11, 1,200 South Asians, Arabs, and Muslims from mainly this part of the world were rounded up, just rounded up, put into jail, detained, interviewed, and so on. Can you guess how many terrorism-related convictions came out of that? 0, right? Another example, a few months after that, the Justice Department created this program called NSEERS, National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, which required Muslims from about 25 Middle Eastern countries, as well as North Korea, not Muslims, but you get the idea of who the enemies are, to go and register, right, and be interrogated and so forth. 83,000 people actually registered. Of that, how many terrorism convictions resulted? Well, 11 people, a grand total of 11 people were found to have links to terrorism, and the last time I checked, there was not even one conviction associated with this program, right? And actually, it was dropped as of last year, if I'm not mistaken. It was suspended as of last year. So what we've seen really is the wholesale demonization of Muslims and the idea that you're guilty if you're Muslim, right? Guilty until proven innocent. And so the question, of course, is why? Why has this actually taken place? And as I said earlier, societies at war are prone to not just creating an enemy out there against whom war must be waged, but do that internally as well. So for instance, during the First World War, Germans faced all sorts of persecution in the United States. People may remember, of course, one of the sort of signature posters from the World War I period, and this was the Kaiser, who was this big monster, carrying off this half-naked woman. And that was used as propaganda to recruit people against these monsters, against these German monsters and so forth. And there were all sorts of reprisals. Similarly, in World War II, after Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans, over 100,000 Japanese Americans were rounded up, young, old, middle-aged, etc., put into concentration camps. Why? Because the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and therefore all people of Japanese descent must be responsible for these actions, right? Now, of course, later on, several decades later, an official apology was issued. But what about, what happened to the lives of these people in the meantime? And I think that's exactly what is happening to Muslims today. And it's largely happening under the radar until this series of reports that have come to light. It's starting a discussion that I think we should really broaden and continue to have. So how am I doing on time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. Left. Okay. Okay. The last thing I'll say is, so if there is no real threat from the Islamic terrorist, and here again I want to give some figures. The report I cited earlier from the Triangle Center in North Carolina says that in the 10 years between 9/11 and the present, every year the United States has actually has convicted 20 people for supposed terrorist-related activities. Now you have to wonder, why is an entire legal system, why is an entire security apparatus designed to actually go after supposedly these 20 people? And what a pathetic result that after using the resources of the NYPD, of the FBI, of local law enforcement agencies and so on, that this is what we get. We get 20 people. And this is not, and I don't know of these 20 people per year, how many are cases of entrapment. There are these cases that have been put up, the Newburgh 4, for instance, where 4 young African-American men were pretty much entrapped by this guy whose picture is there, who not only found the locations of the synagogues to be bombed, gave them bombs, set them up, and when one of them expressed hesitation to actually kill women and children, he barraged this guy and said, you have to do it, you have to go forward with it. And then, of course, when they did do it, this was a complete PR affair, right? There were TV crews ready and waiting, the cops came in, and just like an episode of 24, here were the good guys apprehending the bad guys. And of course, the question that never got asked is this would never have happened had the entrapper not been there. So I want to actually probably have 2 or 3 minutes left. So I want to spend a little time on the politics of all of this. And that is, there's been a tendency, there are a bunch of really good reports that have exposed the far right-wing Islamophobes, a report called Fear Incorporated, which I would recommend that people check out. The far right-wingers are just, atrocious people. But there's been a tendency among the left to see Islamophobia as the kind of language that only the far right uses, or that only the Republicans use, when in fact Islamophobia is a bipartisan project, just as the war on terror is a bipartisan project. And I'll give an example of this. Now, part of why preemptive persecution, which Steve is going to take on in more detail, why that happens, the logic, the theory that's put forward, is the idea that we need to catch these people before they become terrorists, right? And these theories of radicalization have been put forward. The NYPD and the FBI have this 4-step program, and it starts, of course, with being a devout Muslim and then goes downhill from there. You get the idea. But it's these really reductionist ideas that attempt to capture the complexity of human behavior in 4 steps. It's completely ludicrous. It's been debunked not just by left and liberal sociologists and scholars, but even by a study by MI5. MI5 being the Secret Service agency of the British. MI5 has actually debunked these radicalization theories. But nevertheless, this is not a partisan project. And yet, when Peter King held his radicalization hearings, right, back in February, March of last year, it was rightly denounced as being like McCarthyism, right? But not a peep, actually very little of a peep was raised when Obama released his counter-radicalization strategy in August of last year, pretty much accepting and adopting all of these theories and proposing similar sorts of solutions. So I want to come to a close with this. I think that right now we have an opportunity to expose the systematic nature of anti-Muslim racism. I think we need to read more about it, learn more about it, and we've got to show how it benefits a society geared towards war, and how the war abroad is always and inevitably followed by a war at home, and that this is a bipartisan project, and we shouldn't put our faith in the Democrats, and certainly not in Obama, because while Obama says the right things, his job really is to put a pretty face on a very ugly and racist reality. So let's not buy that, and let's continue to fight against Islamophobia.